Mastering should and ought to in English, expressing expectations. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our series on intermediate English grammar. Today, we're going to dive into the fascinating world of modal verbs, focusing specifically on should and ought to. We'll explore how these modal verbs can be used to express expectations in English. So, let's get started. Modal verbs are a unique type of verb that express modality. That's a fancy word for things like possibility, necessity, and permission. Today, we're focusing on should and ought to. These two modal verbs are commonly used to talk about expectations. Let's break this down in the next section. The verb should is a very versatile tool in English. It's often used to express that something is expected or recommended to happen. For example, you should finish your homework before playing video games. This sentence implies an expectation that the homework needs to be done first. Now, let's look at ought to. Much like should, ought to expresses expectation or advice. However, ought to is slightly more formal. Here's an example. You ought to respect your elders. This sentence expresses the expectation that it's proper to respect one's elders. At this point, you might be wondering, when should you use should and when ought to? Well, in many cases, they're interchangeable. However, remember that ought to is more formal and less commonly used in conversation. Also, in negative forms and questions, should is usually preferred. It's time for a little practice. I'll give you some situations, and your task is to form sentences using should or ought to. Remember to keep in mind the slight differences between the two. 1. You want to advise your friend to eat healthily. 2. You expect that it will rain later. 3. You think your sister needs to study more for her exams. Pause the video here, form your sentences, and when you're ready, hit play to continue and check your answers. Answers will be given after the practice section. That's it for today's lesson on should and ought to. I hope you now feel confident expressing expectations in English using these two modal verbs. Remember, practice makes perfect, so don't be shy to use should and ought to in your daily conversations. Happy learning, and see you in our next lesson.